Seeking agreement on the international arms trade, 150 nations meet to hammer out a deal to halt the uncontrolled flow of weapons and ammunition. Weapons rights groups say help fuel wars, atrocities and human rights abuses. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. Welcome to the show. Human rights groups say one person is killed every minute because of armed violence through conflict and crime, but no globally agreed standards exist to regulate the international trade in arms. A trade in dangerous and deadly products designed to kill and maim. An industry worth some $70 billion a year. The world's biggest weapons exporters, the US, China and Russia, stalled on a deal at a UN conference last year. So what hope of a breakthrough now? And will any compromise lead to a weak and meaningless pact? Al Jazeera's diplomatic editor James Bays is at the United Nations in New York.
10 working days have been set aside for these negotiations. They're supposed to be concluded by the 28th of this month. The organisers and campaigners hopeful that they can come up finally with an arms trade treaty. In fact, the organisers have named these negotiations. The formal name is the final negotiations for an arms trade treaty. Of course, we have been here before. Last year, in July last year, there were talks. Campaigners who watched this very closely say they believe that they made substantial progress on the text, on a draft treaty, but at the last minute the United States said that it needed more time to study the details and wanted to postpone things. Russia then said that it also wanted a postponement to study the details a little closer. Of course, in July last year, we were just a few months away from the US election. The whole issue of arms and gun control, a highly charged issue here in the United States. Campaigners believe this time around there is a real chance of getting a treaty passed. James Bays at the United Nations for Inside Story.
Now, before I bring in our guest, let me give you an idea of the sheer scale of total military expenditure worldwide. This includes absolutely everything, by the way. Latest figures put the annual expenditure at $1,630 billion, a figure that's hard to compute. A quote there too from UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He says the world is overarmed and peace is underfunded. And then there's the rolling clock. How much is spent in a day? Make a note if you can. It is showing over $3 billion as we start the show. We'll go back at the end to see just how much it has gone up by. Let's go straight then to our guest in New York. Brian Wood, he's Arms Control Manager at Amnesty International. In London, Joanna Spear, Associate Professor of International Affairs at George Washington University and an author on arms sales and controls. And in our New Delhi bureau, Bharat Kanad, Senior Fellow of National Security Studies at the Centre for Policy Research in the Indian capital. Welcome, all three of you. Thank you for joining us. Brian, are you quietly confident some sort of deal will be reached, or is it just a waste of time?
I think we'll get a treaty either at the end of the conference, or if it has to go back into a vote at the General Assembly. I'm fairly confident. The big issue is what kind of treaty. Will it be strong enough to try to prevent the war crimes, the serious human rights violations, and all the other harm that's caused to millions of people around the world?
What is Amnesty International pushing for?
Well, our central thrust is that the treaty needs a golden rule, which says that if there's a substantial risk that a transfer would be used or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law or international human rights law, then it won't be sent. That's what we call the golden rule, and that's the central debate here. Of course, there are other important issues. Some transfers need to be prohibited outright, so there's various express prohibitions written into the draft treaty. Those are already in international law, but they're restatements, and there's a debate because the United States have put forward a proposal that doesn't meet international law standards, so they're reviewing that at the moment. And then there are other issues that come into the criteria, like the question of transnational organized crime, corruption, gender-based armed violence, violence against children, and of course the diversion of arms into the illicit markets is a very big issue for all states. So that's the central part, and then the states have to agree what the scope of the treaty will be, what arms should it cover, and at the moment some arms are optional and some are mandatory. The mandatory ones however, exclude quite a lot. They include small arms and light weapons and all the big offensive weapon systems, but they don't include all types of military equipment. And moreover, the United States wanted to keep ammunition out of the treaty altogether. So at the moment there's a compromise where ammunition is partly included, and then parts and components are particularly important because they've become such an enormous part of the arms trade, and they're only partly included. Technology transfers are not themselves included, although they were originally proposed under the previous chair of the conference, Ambassador Moritan.
Joanne, any chance of seeing some sort of framework that countries can adhere to?
One of the things that Brian's reflecting is the fact that a number of compromises have been made already to get this far. And so the question is, what other compromises can be done to ensure the maximum number of states, parties, are willing to accept the treaty? The idea of kind of the golden mechanism is somewhat controversial. The United States has been trying to give itself a little bit of wriggle room in this, and is slightly uncomfortable with this idea. So I think there's a lot of politics, as was indicated, a lot of politics attached to the treaty. And because it contains both suppliers and recipients, and suppliers with different perspectives and recipients with different perspectives, there's really an awful lot going on trying to get 193 different states to agree on something that's actually worthwhile, or does it have to be so cut away at to bring compromise that it's actually not a strong treaty that everybody could actually do anything with?
But if, say, the US and Russia or China oppose anything that's been put forward, could we see some sort of watered down treaty, or could something be signed that leaves out those who are not interested in it?
You could see something signed with those states not as parties to it. And there are those that are advocating for that rather than compromising too much. And then, of course, the other facet of that is it could mean that those states could become parties later on. But actually, if they are in the treaty mechanism, then their parliaments or Congresses have to agree to this, and that for the US and maybe for Russia too would be another step in the process where things could get tripped up. So there are those that are saying it would be better to exclude them than to compromise the treaty process too much.
Okay. Bharat, what is India's position? Does it support some sort of trade, and what are its concerns?
Well, I think the Indian government, as it's vote, accepts the treaty, I think, in a generalized fashion, and thinks of armed trade as something that ought to be responsible. Now, I'm not quite sure just how these things do things mesh up, because, is there such a thing as a responsible arms trade? I mean, the problem here is the vested interests of the supplier countries is so manifest in terms of the defense industry's contribution to the economy, the employment aspects, the millions employed in the defense industries, and with recession and whatnot, the Western economies or supplier country economies are so dependent on the export market.
I mean, that must be key to all of this, isn't it? I mean, it's all about big fat barrels of cash, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? I mean, ultimately it is profit-making that the defense industrial companies are, in a sense, survive on.
And if they're saying to their governments, look, we're bringing in this amount of money, we're employing this amount of people. Don't try and stop us. It's hard to ignore that.
That's right. And the problem, I think, ultimately is, even assuming you get some kind of a treaty, is there a verification mechanism? Is there an oversight mechanism? Is there going to be an enforcement mechanism? Or is it just a paper document that everybody signs on to feel good about, and then no one cares a whit about whether it's enforceable or not? Or any country, in a sense, actually adheres to the provisions in it or not. So I think there's a real problem here.
Yeah, Brian, I mean,
I think
a
at the
great
core
idea.
of the treaty...
Sorry, let me bring Brian in here. I mean, how do you enforce this, if anything is agreed to?
Well, at the moment, every state party would have to make an annual report and make those reports available to all of the other states. What Amnesty International and many governments are pushing for now is that those reports are made public. So the reports would cover all the measures taken to implement the treaty, plus an annual report on all authorizations or transfers of conventional arms. So when the meeting of states parties happens, which we hope would be every year or every second year, then there will be a lot of peer group pressure on states that are way out of compliance. So that's the first thing. It was proposed early on in the deliberations, because remember, this discussion has been going on in the United Nations since 2006, and Amnesty International and others are promoting the treaty from the mid-1990s, so this is not new. A couple of states proposed having an international verification mechanism. Now, that kind of thing is not accepted by most of the states at the moment. It's accepted for weapons of mass destruction. Of course, with the UN arms embargoes, we've got the investigative panels and the United Nations committees that oversee it. But in this area of trade and regulation, it's going to be the reports, it's going to be the mechanisms that states are required to implement nationally. So licensing systems, end-use control systems, control on arms brokering, control on transit and transshipments of arms.
Okay,
all those
kinds of things,
if you don't mind, can I bring in Joanna here?
Will be in the treaty.
Sure. Joanna, you talk a lot about, and you write about sale and trade. Let's bring in Abu Dhabi, the arms trade there recently. I mean, cluster bombs were at this trade fair. So, and there's some sort of treaty surrounding that, and clearly it's not being imposed. So if it's not going to work there, how's it going to work anywhere else?
One of the intentions, I think, and Brian was alluding to this, is that should a treaty be achieved, each party to it would put those restrictions into their own national export regulations so that it would bring everybody up to being on the same page. There is indeed, as you say, a cluster munitions treaty which was signed in Oslo in 2008. If a state is not a party to that, then they can go ahead with such things, which is why you may have seen such cluster bombs at the Abu Dhabi Arms Fair. So one of the reasons for actually trying to do this is to bring everybody up to the same standard, and through the transparency mechanisms to actually ensure that those standards are being met. And as Brian says, one of the intentions would be to put peer pressure on all states that were party to it to actually live up to those obligations.
Now, let's not forget what we're talking about. It's a massive global industry here. The international trade in conventional weapons is worth an estimated $70 billion a year. In that time, 8 million guns and other small arms are made. That's almost 22,000 a day. Then there's ammunition. Some 12 billion bullets are produced every year. That industry alone is worth more than $4 billion. And this has been a stumbling block, with the US calling for ammunition to be excluded from any arms treaty. You did touch on this, Brian. Why would they stick to that? Why would they say that that's not part of it? Surely it's the ammunition that kills.
Well, yeah. Well, the first thing is that most states regard ammunition imports and supplies as you know, more sensitive than most other conventional arms transfers. Any consumables in the military services are more highly sensitive. So there's that issue. But in the United States, there's particular pressure from the gun owners and the NRA on the Congress to not interfere with imports of ammunition for firearms. And if you've got a treaty that has got anti-diversion measures in it, you know, some states might say, well, you know, things are going to be diverted from the United States into Mexico and so on, so they don't want to authorize them to the United States. So there is an issue there, but all countries have to face up to that. And the fact is that the United States does regulate ammunition exports and imports. They regulate them fairly strictly, and they also report on them, which many states don't do. So some of that is, I think, you know, posturing. Some of it is needless. There's no reason why the treaty can't also cover ammunition, and in fact, all the major munitions that fall under the conventional arms categories should be in the treaty, and that's what the European Union and most of the other countries want to see. The African group in particular want to see the coverage, particularly of ammunition. So I think that's still going to be a very big debate.
Okay. Joanna, if the US were to want some sort of treaty, do you think the gun lobby would even allow them to sign a treaty? They say that they'll scupper any attempts to do just that. Are they that powerful?
The gun lobby...
The Gun Rifle Association.
Yes, the National Rifle Association is taking a very all-or-nothing approach to this treaty, which actually might not benefit them in the longer term. They are very concerned about domestic politics, and they see the treaty through the lens of domestic politics, which is not where other countries are necessarily how they're viewing it, which is why you get this discrepancy. The key concern with ammunition, I think, is that it connects in some ways to Second Amendment rights for Americans, the right to bear arms and to use them. So one of the concerns, I think, amongst politicians in the Obama administration is if ammunition is in the treaty, it will be used by groups such as the National Rifle Association to ensure that the treaty is scuppered, because it will be presented as preventing Americans from legitimately protecting themselves. So there's a lot of politics in this, and the National Rifle Association has said that they do not want a treaty to be ratified, and it would therefore be action in the US Senate, which would have to approve by a 2/3 majority, that would be the key to this. And it's not absolutely clear that the Obama administration would have a 2/3 majority on this, because traditionally the NRA does have a lot of sway because they have a lot of voters. What has slightly changed the balance of power, though, is with the awful events at Newtown with the killing of the children in school. And that did actually slightly change the mood music in America, and has actually emboldened the Obama administration to begin to try and tackle some domestic arms control. So the NRA is a little bit on the back foot here, but nevertheless, if they spun it in such a way to declare that the treaty, through including things like ammunition and even other things, was threatening Second Amendment rights, they would be in a strong position to make it very difficult to pass it.
Right, let's take a moment to look at who the main players are in the global arms trade. The United States is the biggest weapons exporter, accounting for nearly 1/3 of world trade, followed by Russia with 26%. Germany, France and China completing the top positions. Interesting to note that Britain has been knocked out of the top 5 for the first time, overtaken by China. And here's where the weapons are going. India is the biggest importer of conventional weapons, accounting for 12% of imports. China is also a major importer, buying 6% of the world's weapons. Pakistan and South Korea import 5% each, and Singapore is at 4%. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has reacted to news that it is now one of the top 5 arms exporters in the world and defended its record on arms sales.
Apart from adhering to UN Security Council resolutions and international law, China is also implementing its strict domestic regulations. On arms exports, China sticks to 3 principles. First, that it is conducive to the recipient country's self-defense needs. Second, it does not damage regional and global peace, security and stability. Third, it does not interfere in other countries' internal affairs.
Does not interfere in other countries' internal affairs. But right, I mean, that's not true, is it? I mean, China sells weapons to countries where it is used by the wrong people.
Well, that's true. I think China has been an egregious proliferator of weapons, both conventional and, of course, everybody knows nuclear weapons technologies, etc. I think what's at stake is really the great basic factor that decides the policies of most countries or the attitudes of most countries on this treaty is the national interest. China can say what it wants to in a pro forma basis, and this is what it's been saying. And curiously, the Chinese position is very much like the American position, that it will not export arms to countries where there's instability and so on and so forth. These are all the usual pablum that really doesn't apply when it actually comes down to selling arms. And so you have the demand side and the supply side. And actually these, in the realistic world that we live in, these do actually service each other. So a treaty like the Arms Trade Treaty that's being contemplated, I'm not quite sure what its prospects are. And because the reality is that there will be a demand for the armaments from countries that feel insecure. And if you look at the world around you, more and more countries feel insecure and are buying armaments. And that caters to the defense industries in the developed countries.
Let's talk about the impact
are relying more
and
more on the export market.
Sure, let's talk more about the impact of these sales, illegal or not. Brian, what are you seeing on the ground? We were looking at pictures there coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Tell us what happens, the human rights abuses linked to this.
Well, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, when the armed conflict really took sway in the recent time from 1998, the number of deaths has been estimated at somewhere in the region of 5 million, directly and indirectly, and many of those people died through disease and, not being able to get access to health services. You've got tens of thousands of women raped by armed groups and soldiers, particularly in the east of the country, and the armed forces of the Congo have been particularly corrupt and inept at holding on to their stocks and managing their arms and using them in a responsible way.
I do want to bring in some of the Facebook reaction that we have been getting. Leila Hakim says of the UN meeting, what a waste of taxpayers' money and everyone's time. The arms trade will never change and will always be in the hands of those who always seem to have a say in every war around the world. These arms trades are what keeps their economies afloat, if not thriving at most times. Alistair Hone says, it doesn't matter what they agree, governments will still be selling arms to poor, corrupt third world nations. And that's where we end the show. Thank you very much to our guests in New York, Brian Wood from our London studios, Joanna Spear, and in our New Delhi bureau, Bharat Kanad. And now before we go, let's just quickly return to that running total of daily military expenditure on arms around the world. When we started the show, I made a note, and this is what it said. The figure then was $3.24 billion. In the 25 minutes or so that I've been talking to you, another $80 million have been spent. A lucrative industry indeed, and you can see why it's such a tough customer. A reminder, you can add your voice to the discussion online on our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also find this program and many more on our website, aljazeera.com. And look for Inside Story under the programs banner. Thanks for watching. From me, Jane Dutton, and the rest of the team, goodbye for now.